just some an overview of what I'm going through here. So the end of the presentation, which should take maybe 10 to 15 minutes or so, then it's just going to be an open discussion guided by some of the questions that I have in the presentation. And if you do have any questions while I'm going through, feel free to just ask them at the time, or you can feel free to wait until the end of the presentation as well. So, sorry. So just for those of you not familiar with the Polar Data Planning Summit, as I mentioned, it will take place from the 22nd to 24th of May in Boulder, Colorado. And as a bit of background, the meeting came to be last summer. It was first discussed and conceptualized at a meeting in Frascati, Italy, where a number of international partners who are focused on Arctic observing were together meeting to talk about a sustained observing network for the Arctic. And the question about data came up, and how do we deal with data, and what needs to happen. And a number of us were talking about it, and we said, there's really a lot happening in polar and Arctic data. However, we're not necessarily connecting all of the different infrastructures and all the different initiatives as well as we could be. So the idea behind this meeting was to bring together a number of groups, initiatives, programs, whatever you want to call them. I'm thinking about them mostly as cyber infrastructures, who actually are funded and who are already operating, and bringing them together to start thinking more about how can they be connecting, how can they be interoperating, and so on. So it's not really meant to be a general sort of conference. There will be a little bit in the way of presentations, and at the end of this presentation, I'll go over the current draft agenda a little bit, but it's a working meeting, and it's intending to bring together groups, as I said, who actually have infrastructure or are soon to have infrastructure. So they've been funded for it, and they're actually going to be doing this. That's not to say that people who are doing other things are not welcome, but the focus will be on that sort of practical work. So to help guide the process, we're using this idea of use cases to scope things. So of course, there's a huge number of possible things to talk about. And one of the comments I've heard, at a number of meetings in the past where we've tried to get together and work on this is it's easy to sort of talk about the challenges and some of the solutions. But if you're not getting into the more specific aspects, it's hard to come up with the solutions that are going to work in the real world. So what we're trying to do is bring together use cases, or initially we were talking about this idea of scenarios, but I'll come back to that later. We're using the term use cases. So what can we focus our efforts to bring together these data centers around? So 3 that came up through discussion over the recent months are on the screen. So the first is looking at understanding of cryospheric extreme events in the past, present, and future. And I'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail because, of course, that's a very vague statement as well. The second is looking at sharing biological and oceanographic data in support of marine science and resource management. And then the last is mobilizing data and information to support vibrant and resilient Arctic communities. So these, of course, are not comprehensive. They don't cover everything that you could think about for Arctic data or polar data, but I think they cover a lot of bases. And what we're trying to do is recognize that these aren't meant to be comprehensive. We just need something to get going on. And the hope is that we can get started a more regular series of meetings, events, etc., where we can continue this work and expand the use cases, refine the existing use cases, and then expand to others as we can. So the first one, which is looking at cryospheric extreme events, we're engaging particularly the Global Cryosphere Watch, which is a program of the World Meteorological Organization, the International Arctic Science Committee. I've had some conversations with people at NSIDC, and we're also starting conversations at the Finnish Meteorological Institute. So a major connection we've made there, an important one I think, is there is actually a workshop on cryospheric extreme events happening in Finland at the end of this month, on the 25th of December, sorry, 25th to 27th of April. So I've reached out to the organizers of that conference, and they're very interested in working with us. The idea is it would be, synergistic or mutually beneficial in that they can be providing the outcomes of that meeting to say, okay, data community, we've identified, a number of the key science questions and issues and so on, and some of our data needs. And that would also help our data community to ground what we're trying to do in science and policy and so on. So we're looking at organizing a number of people who are working on this use case over the next week or so to come together and have more detailed discussions around that. The questions I have, maybe either now or through our discussion at the end of the presentation, would be within the IARPA community. Who should we be reaching out to for this? I've had some initial conversations with Hyoiken, for example, who's interested in this type of thing, but identify other people who have either the science or domain expertise or the data expertise or data infrastructures that might relate to this. So that's the extreme events, cryospheric events. The second is sharing biological and oceanographic data. So this one came out of Pip Britcher from the Southern Ocean Observing System. So Pip is actually engaged in what she describes in an initial document that we're working with, an actual use case that they have, which is bringing together data to look at Patagonian toothfish stock predictions for the Kerguelen Plateau. And that's under both the Southern Ocean Observing System and the CAMLR, which is a marine living resources protocol in the Antarctic. Now, what we're trying to do now is work with other stakeholders or other partners, including Martens Institute in the Netherlands, the ICES, and some other groups to make that a little bit more polar, generalized for polar. How can we actually bring in the Arctic Ocean and that type of thing? I've had some initial conversations with Jackie Grebmeyer on this, so we're looking at in our next meeting at inviting her group to engage in the conversation there to bring together people who are looking at fisheries management and other biological components and so on. So same questions there, for that particular use case, who else within the IARPA community might we want to engage? What kind of infrastructures are out there? Who are some of the experts that we could bring into the fold for this conversation? I would say we're seeing this as iterative, so the conversations will be happening before and during the meeting in May, but it doesn't mean that in May they're going to stop. The idea is to get a really good start at the meeting, and then we have a number of other events, and I'll mention a few of those at the end that we want to use as follow-up to the summit. So the last is the mobilizing data information to support vibrant and resilient Arctic communities. So this is looking more from a community perspective and including, community concerns, linking to indigenous knowledge, all kinds of other data, etc. We have had Carolina Behe from Inuit Circumpolar Council, who's also a lead of the IARPA Coastal Resilience Team. Gunbritt Redder from Sami Council, Scott Nichols and Anita Cora from Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami involved in this, and a number of other Aloka partners with the Aloka project that Colleen and I work on. So this one's a bit of a challenge. The challenge, of course, is we have groups like ICC and Sami Council and ITK who really want to engage, but they have less capacity in the area of data, less expertise and less resources to engage in something like this. So we don't want to simply say, okay, we're not seeing that. We don't want to include it. But at the same time, we're trying to work with them to say, how do we deal with that general issue of having resources within their own organizations? There's no shortage of data centers and so on who could say, well, we could maybe step in on their behalf, but we're really trying to get them at the table directly. So any thoughts there would be appreciated as well. Those are the 3 use cases. There are a few others that are sort of being thought about but haven't been formally proposed, and I think what we're trying to do again is keep this quite practical and manageable, so we don't want to overload ourselves and not be able to do much of anything on any particular use case. So we'll likely keep it at those 3 for at least through the meeting, and then discuss at the meeting if we want to expand. Some of the cyber infrastructures that are involved, not all of these are actual, infrastructures, but they're either cyber infrastructures, data centers and so on, or they're groups that are working very closely with data centers on data management and coordination, et cetera. So we have the Arctic Data Committee out of International Arctic Science Committee in Seon, the same type of group out of the SCAR Antarctic community called SCATM, the Southern Ocean Observing System. Global Cryosphere Watch is sort of a combination. It's an organizing, coordinating, and science body, but it also has actual data infrastructure that's being developed in partnership with a lot of med agencies around the world. The Geo-Cold Regions Initiative, so again, it's a coordinating body, but it's also working with the GEOS cyber infrastructure. The Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure, which is an emerging cyber infrastructure coming that's associated with the Arctic Council, but mostly coming out of the national mapping agencies in the circumpolar region. Polar View Earth observations are developing a number of different tools, some of them funded by European Space Agency. We have the Arctic Portal out of Iceland, but also again does a lot of work with Arctic Council. And then these groups as well. So IASA, which is the International Arctic Social Sciences Association, they're not a data infrastructure, but they're very much interested in the whole data question. Similarly with University of the Arctic, I'm not sure, Lars Kullerud, the president of UArctic, was going to try to make it, but he's overseas right now, so he may not be on the call yet. They are moving into this field with their member universities and looking at how universities host data, how they make it available and so on. So he's very interested in being part of the conversation and so on. A big partner here is the EU Arctic Cluster. For those of you not familiar with the EU Arctic Cluster, it's now a group of 8 different funded European Commission projects mostly under the Horizon 2020 program. And I think that adds up to about 70 to 80 million euros of investment in the Arctic over the next 3 years. So not all of those projects are cyber infrastructure intensive, but several of them are, and particularly the Intaros project that is bringing together observing systems and linking them through data infrastructure. So we have a couple of representatives from that cluster coming to talk about what they're doing. We, of course, have IARPIC and all of its members. There's a new initiative in Canada called the Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability that has about, I think, 10 partners and about 7 universities involved, all stitching together various infrastructure that's related to the Polar Data Workshop in Canada. We have FMI, National Institute of Polar Research in Japan. Government of Northwest Territories actually approached us and would like to attend the meeting because they're building mostly spatial data infrastructure with ArcGIS and so on. And then Lynn's organization, Research Data Alliance, will be attending as well. And that's really important because we're also trying to figure out how do we link all of the stuff that's happening at a polar scale or Arctic scale and think about it, linking it, upscaling it to the global, what's happening globally in terms of research data management and so on. And then we have, as I mentioned, a number of Indigenous organizations who are part of the conversation. So those are the groups that we have. Some are not named here. So we have, obviously under IARPIC, there's the NSF Arctic Data Center. We've been in conversations with NASA, Above Program, NOAA, NCEI, and others. So the draft agenda, I will see if this works here. I'm just going to drag my screen here. And I won't go into great detail here, but I just wanted to provide a sense of where we're going with it. Okay, so should be able to see it. So it's a 2.5-day meeting, and try and make sure you can actually see the half day. Oh, sorry. The half day being to allow for people to arrive on the first day in the morning. We have a number of North Americans who wanted to fly in that morning. We're going to bring people together in the first afternoon. We'll be going over a number of past meetings that have happened. So we've actually had a lot of activity over the last decade, but particularly over the last 2 to 3 years, we have a number of international workshops looking at interoperability and so on. We've had 2 Polar Data Forum meetings and that type of thing. So there'll be a little bit of an overview of what's happened in the last couple of years in particular. We're going to have some talks by some particular cyber infrastructures that are actually already in place and who are already working on interoperability, just to get a sense of what they're doing, what protocols they're using, and so on. We want to then actually have some detailed discussion about the use cases that I just mentioned. But to kick that off, and I'm going to replace this TBD soon with Sandy's name, just kind of an overview talk about how we connect all of this to society, science, decision making, and then the use of scenario planning, so we can start to think about how do we formalize as a community, deciding where we're going to go and how we're going to go as a community. And we'll wrap up the first day with lightning talks, where anybody who's on that list or anybody attending can talk about their stuff for a couple or a few minutes, and we're also providing opportunity for posters. The second day is really going to be hands-on. So the first morning we're looking at, I'm looking at right now having a technical track and then what I'll call a context and scenarios track. So for those who are not particularly technical, which I think will be the minority, but we want to have a place where they can be talking about some of the contextual issues. But most of the focus will be on the technical track, and that's based on our previous meetings, where we all said it's really nice to get together and to show our PowerPoints and talk about the issues, but there's been very little time for the technical people to actually sit down, roll their sleeves up, and start saying, okay, how are we going to address this particular issue? So the first half day will be focused on data discovery, so things like metadata standards and specification services. Then we'll also talk about, Ruth will lead us on some discussion around the semantic aspects of data discovery, things like merging keywords, etc. And then documenting that and following that into an actual architecture design session, where we'll be looking at saying, okay, with the infrastructures that we have in the room, or that we know about through other types of communication, combining those with these use cases, what does our architecture look like in terms of bringing together our infrastructures? We already have a group working on that. So Pip Richer, Taco De Bruin, and Alexander Smirnov from the out of Porto are leading a group that's looking at federated search. So they've done some work already that they'll present here just to get us started. And what we hope to have is at least, it'll be a straw man. It'll be something I think that will certainly not be final and will probably take months or years to sort of continue discussing, but something practical that we can look at and check out. The afternoon of the second day will focus on the same type of approach, but looking more at data services. So not metadata and not data discovery, but actually connecting data to data infrastructures. Pardon me. And that includes things like data services, but also the semantic aspects, vocabularies, and that type of thing will be included in that. And again, with the ultimate objective of having, a high-level architecture design that we could build on. At the same time, we'll be looking at having the context and scenario. People talk about some of the drivers, identification of the actors, the various infrastructures, doing some concept mapping to establish the relationships, and so on, and then looking at how we need to start thinking as a community of planning into the future and writing that up with the idea of moving that towards various meetings coming up. And then third day, we'll be sort of wrapping up, looking at not just the data and discovery, but how do we process those data? How do we use some of these new cloud computing environments to actually do modeling? How do we use them to synthesize and so on? So Matt, I've taken the liberty, actually, I know you have at least one representative coming, Chris, who may or may not be able to give this talk, but if not, I'd like to maybe think about a virtual talk on the work that you guys do at NC's on synthesis. And that idea of how do we actually take all these data resources and bring them together to serve particular needs.
Okay.
So that's the idea there in the morning, is to work on that more sort of processing, or what I call mediation level, is once you have the data connected and discoverable and so on, what do you do with it? The afternoon will focus on, okay, let's document this and also talk a little bit about the future as a community. So how do we actualize some of these things? How do we keep it moving? How do we continue to coordinate the efforts with the increasing number of polar data initiatives and coming up with models there? And then the very end is to write some of this up, at least in draft form, for a number of upcoming meetings that we see as follow-ups to the summit. So very soon after the summit will be the Arctic Science Summit Week in Davos, Switzerland. And so we have several days booked there with a number of the partners in this session where we can continue some of the discussion and work. We have the Arctic Observing Summit, which is also in Davos at that time. We have a geoplenary that's coming up in the fall, the Arctic Science Ministerial, which is not so much a working meeting, but we can report there. So that is the current sort of draft agenda over the next month or so. We'll be working with the various participants and community to sort of build on that. And I believe that takes me to the end of my presentation. It does. So that's an overview. Took a few more minutes than I expected, but I just wanted to get the information to you, but also now get any feedback that you have in terms of any of the use cases that you saw or any of the issues that that came up or suggested parts of the draft agenda. And as I always say in the start, as the first person to put up their hand gets a virtual beer purchased by me for them the next time I see them.
So Peter, this looks great, but it looks really packed.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like I was really interested in those technical sessions in the middle. And you have 3 really rich technical discussions in, I think I saw it was an hour and a half as breakouts. Can you kind of describe how all that is going to fit into that 90-minute period?
Yeah, so I'm actually seeing it as a bit more flexible than the agenda would indicate. So this first part, the idea for the data discovery is to give the technical people a half a day. Some of the things I would like to see are, some documentation, et cetera. However, if they're feeling they want to dive more into the architecture, they can spend, half an hour, 45 minutes on, just the overview. I'm also going to be I am working right now on the number of background documents that I'm going to be putting out to particular people as well, and saying, please make sure that you're aware of this before you go into the meeting. So you don't have to spend an hour talking about, what data catalogs are out there, which data catalogs are already doing federated search. What I'm also considering, and I wanted to talk about, I don't know if we can go into all the details here, but what I've found at these meetings is we have some people who are really specialized on metadata and discovery, and saying to them, look, if you want to continue for the rest of the day working as a smaller group on the architecture and so on, do so. You have similar things. There are people who are a bit more focused on the data services. We could try and start both of them up top. The problem we also have, though, is some people do both. So there's always this problem of, well, I can't be in 2 places at once, so can we run them sequentially? But that was part of it. And I also thought if people, for example, really get on a roll in the second afternoon on the architecture design for the data services, maybe they could skip some of the processing stuff on the third day and just keep going. I obviously don't want to have the whole meeting go off and do that, but it seems like we have these little clusters of people. So there's a few people I know who do more on the processing side and and that type of thing. So it's not easy to reflect that here, and I want to iterate through this. This is like really a first draft of the agenda, but how can we work through that, and maybe engaging people like you and others who've really done a lot of this type of work to figure out how we can make it work in a known short period of time. So any suggestions you have, and feel free to do it here or send me an email or whatever. I'm also looking at setting up a conference call soon for those who've registered or who I know are planning to attend, and that would be, I'd say, in the next 2 weeks or so, 2.5 weeks, to discuss some of these details. Tomorrow I'll be sending out an email just putting this agenda out there for people to digest and come back with feedback like you just provided.
Yeah, interesting.
The other hope is that, again, the intention isn't to stop the conversation at this meeting, is if we can build on some of the groups that have already formed. So the federated search group and the semantics group have already formed. Maybe we end up with one that looks more at data services and can say, yeah, we couldn't get all the work done in Boulder, but anybody who's in Davos, let's meet there, keep the conversation going. I spoke with people in the Geo Cold Regions Initiative yesterday. They want to organize a meeting probably sometime in October to bring people together around this topic. The Arctic Data Committee has its next meeting probably in November in Switzerland. So if we kind of get enough people interested and saying, yeah, this is valuable, the hope is we can then start to schedule times where we can keep building on it.
Yeah, Peter, this is Bill Manley. So in the past, you've talked about how this is the start of progress, if you will. And so I think it'd be really helpful during the meeting to really clarify a focus for subsequent working sessions.
Yeah, that's a great comment, Bill. The idea was to do that, through the use cases. I think we're still in that sort of get to know you phase a bit around use cases, and we need to engage more in developing those. I'm suspecting that at least a subset of these participants are going to rally, particularly around the cryospheric extremes use case, and hopefully we can continue that one. And I am getting more responses from people on the biology one as well. The third one, I'm not sure. Well, I think there's some bigger challenges there, as I mentioned. But yeah, that's the hope, because I think at our past meetings, many of which you've attended, we've talked a lot in the abstract and brought up a lot of really good points, but we haven't managed to sort of go too far in terms of implementation. So point well taken.
Yeah, great.
Bill, I also will be in touch with you. I don't have it on the agenda yet, but I would really hope that you and or Allison, I'm not sure if you can make it, Allison, but can speak about the work that you're doing under the Alaska Data Integration Working Group and the metadata work there. So that would be on the, in the discovery session of the meeting.
Sure. Yeah. I think you're on top of things here. It's just, I think it's terribly important to have really clear, tight, focused objectives for subsequent working sessions.
Yeah. And when you say subsequent working sessions, are you referring to what I was saying, Davos and beyond, or?
Or, well, you mentioned the other working groups that are kind of aligned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just had a meeting. The semantics group
where
had
the rubber hits the road in terms of actually implementing interoperability, is having a small group of partners with mutual goals that hammer out the details.
Yeah, exactly. And just for those of you not involved, the semantics group met on Tuesday, and I participated in that. Mark from Matt's group was there, and Ruth and a number of others. So I sort of explicitly said to them on Tuesday that we're going to be increasingly calling upon groups like that, like you said, to really engage them and task them in a way and say, look, we've met and these are the issues that people really need to resolve. And people in that group are really open to that. I think there were close to 15 people on that call. So we're starting to get a really good critical mass of people with particular expertise and the ability to do stuff because they're funded. So keep reminding us of that as we go forward, both in the planning and during the meeting as well, because it's, they use the term herding cats. It's sometimes hard to keep that focus when you've got so many different important topics to talk about.
Yeah. So Peter, can I ask another question, which is,
sure.
I think we've mentioned this before, but obviously Arctic data management is not entirely unique compared to cyber infrastructure and data management across all of the sciences. And things like federated search have been well developed in more global infrastructures. Are we going to address in here the relationship, rather than building a, say, Arctic specific federated search, integrating with existing federated search systems like Data One or GEOS or others that, are, I think, have pretty good momentum behind them?
Yeah. So that's one of the reasons that we're bringing a GEOS representative to the meeting. Yubao Chu is going to represent there, but he's going to a GEOS meeting 2 weeks before the summit, which is happening in early May. And I've asked him for some very specific things to bring to our meeting so that we can make it clear that there are existing infrastructures. There's also a lot of work happening in ESEP and a number of different groups. So one thing I've asked of the people organizing the federated search group is, there are some really great, keen people there who are ready to write code. And I'm constantly saying, well, before we start writing code, I know it's kind of boring to write this up and to do these reviews and do your lit review, but let's do it. Because I don't think any of our, funders like Mark who are on the line here are not going to appreciate funding something and find out a year later, actually, you could have leveraged an existing infrastructure. So we're trying to do that even within our own community to say, well, we already have some things that maybe aren't fully federated search, but we at least have, harvesting of metadata and so on. Let's identify those, and then let's identify these larger ones. So part of this meeting as well is to sort of measure that, and reason why I'm really happy that Lynn's coming as well, so she can inform us on what's happening with Research Data Alliance. Ruth is very much involved in AGU SE as well as ESIP, and a number of other partners are there. Those are a bit more sort of RDA is international, the others are a bit more US focused, but I think, yeah, what you say is critical and something we really have to do as a community.
Thanks.
Any other thoughts, comments, either on the technical side or on the use cases side?
Just to echo that last.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Real quick, just to echo that last comment, it's critical that we do not reinvent the wheel. Let's take advantage of what's already there. Yeah,
I agree, and something I'm sort of doing a bit in my academic writing too is looking into the not invented here syndrome, which I think is part of life. It happens everywhere, but we really have to be aware of tendency sometimes for people to want to say, oh, look, we have a reason why we can do it differently or better or whatever, and just figure out how do we manage that, because sometimes that is the case, but other times, there's no good business case for it. And one of the target outputs for this, for the results of this summit and beyond, is the Arctic Observing Summit, which is in Davos. And the focus of that is the business case for Arctic observing and including data management. So we have to start thinking as a community about that. What is the business case? And if something already exists, you'd be hard pressed to convince me as a funder that I should do it again.
Yeah, I think part of that is also that there's this, everybody's part of one or more communities of practice that are pretty tightly tied together. And the issue is when there are overlapping communities of practice, it's hard to figure out where the boundaries are to building infrastructure to support them. And so you see in some of the open source communities, they've really managed to expand those communities of practice to include lots of different disciplines. And in our very specialized infrastructure areas, I think if we could do that as well, if we could build communities of practice around things like federated search, where people are contributing to a smaller number of more globally applicable products, then it really helps promote interoperability and reuse of infrastructure instead of inventing it multiple times. But you really have to figure out a way to get those what aren't really shared communities of practice to work together. And it's hard to do because everybody has their own, rightfully they have their own priorities for what's important to them during any given working period. And
yeah, that's actually a really interesting point too, is that the perspective you're coming from. I started my career in the open source geospatial community, developing tools, and starting up groups like OSGeo and so on. And again, we didn't really think too much about the specific domain that it was being used in. We were thinking more about making really robust, flexible tools. And I ended up, dealing with everything from social sciences to oceans management to forestry and so on. Whereas we're coming at, like you said, more from a domain-specific community of practice and a regionally defined one too, which makes it even a bit more challenging. So thanks for that. Okay, there was another comment, I think, that somebody was trying to make.
Yeah, it was from Sandy. I'll speak a little bit on behalf of Tennille. We were just having a sidebar in my office. So I think I understand the mapping between the use case scenarios and this workshop. It could be that in trying to compress a lot of things into the scope of this workshop, that the title could end up misleading to some people. So, for example, the point she brought up was that the tagline for this specific meeting included extreme weather, and that she felt it wasn't clear how this discussion related to data management around extreme weather. I know it's one of the use case scenarios, but are we maybe sort of over-promising and having this breadth of use case scenarios plus this breadth of technical discussion that some people who might have specific interests related to the use case scenarios might feel left behind by a lot of the discussion? And Tennille, if I'm putting words in your mouth, feel free to change it up.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I would say the biggest thing that I'm struggling with at the moment, or has since the inception of this, is the development of appropriate use cases. And it's just because, you know, in speaking with Jari, who's leading the workshop that I mentioned, he said even within their community, their big discussion at their Helsinki workshop will be defining what an extreme event is. So when you're trying to bring together, you know, the data community with the, you know, with the science community or policy community, whatever, that is a challenge. What we found, not so much with the extreme events one, which was initially the one that people seem most interested in. You know, back in Montreal, we had a meeting last fall and said, you know, what would be a good use case? And everybody said, oh, you know, we should be doing something with weather data, something around extreme events and so on. It's been the one hardest to get any detail on. I'm still trying to work with the domain experts to say, okay, well, very specifically, how could we do it so that we're not over-promising and we're not misrepresenting, so that we can get some details around that very general title. And that, I'm hoping, is going to develop a bit more over the next couple of weeks, as well as through the workshop. But I'm not sure we can completely deal with it, you know, in its entirety. And I'm also trying to manage expectations in saying that this is not meant to be, the summit is probably an unfortunate title for the meeting in a sense too, in that it is meant to be a stop along the way. And it is meant to be iterative so that we can say, yeah, this use case is way too broad. It's implying way too much. And any help that you or Tennille or anybody in the community, and why I had those questions, you know, who else do we need to engage in this, would be really useful to say, how can we bring it down to something manageable? At the same time, we have partners in the data community who really want to start being able to sort of test and demonstrate what they're doing. So particularly Global Cryosphere Watch. So they have infrastructure that are there in some cases and will be installed and developed in other cases. And they want to start using it. And so then we just need, yeah, what's the story? You know, in a way, maybe it's a solution looking for a problem, but we do want to do that, and hopefully can bring enough people together to make something that, like you said, is not completely, you know, out there in terms of feasibility. That probably doesn't answer your question, but it does. It recognizes that I think we're well aware of the problem that we currently have. Where we lack is the domain expertise.
So this is Ruth, and a comment on that. So that first day's discussion of the use cases and scoping them, I think, will be very important to the rest of the, in particular, the technical track, because I don't think the technical tracks would be very successful without some stakeholders from that use case, you know, from a domain expertise standpoint for those use cases, to be present and to, you know, keep saying, well, we need to have this kind of data or this capability, or you know, they have to be there, and the use case has to be constrained enough that they can sort of basically, you know, tell the technical community, hi, here's the requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the whole point of doing the use case versus just saying, you know, let's talk about, you know, connecting data. The idea, though, is not to do that work as much as possible, not to do that work at the meeting. So that's where working with some subgroups on use cases now and trying to develop those, have them available, you know, with some lead time at least. And it's a bit of a challenge. So with the extreme events. The conference is at the end of April, but we're hoping to sort of follow up on that fairly quickly and maybe use some of the output from that to help refine it. The biology one, I think, is actually in reasonably good shape because we started out with a very specific use case. And I think, working with a couple of our Arctic experts that we have spoken with, we can bring that down to something that's a bit more manageable as well. The third one, I have a sense that for this meeting may just be more of a conceptual thing and marking that we need to do some work in that area. I'm not sure that we'll actually be doing technical work on that one by May, simply because of the capacity issues that we talked about. So yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts, comments?
Yeah, Peter, this is Will on a non-technical issue. I'm sure you're aware that there was just a workshop in Nome on community-based observational data and TEK, and it would be good to get some of those people involved here. I've been trying to get some of them involved on our observational subgroup unsuccessfully, but and maybe you're aware of that workshop, but there seems to be some overlap with with your case there.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. I don't have a lot in the details.
Well, there's a report out due out soon, and I can, offline I can connect you.
Yeah,
if necessary. And you may know plenty anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues here as well is not so much a technical issue. It's a broader issue in that we have a number of different infrastructures that are in place, and we know a lot about that domain. And like I said, the project that I work on, Aloka, and a number of others work in this area. One of the challenges we've had, though, is to try and get particularly when we're thinking about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities, Indigenous leadership around it, so that it's not somebody, a non-Indigenous person from a Southern institution sitting at the table. And so that's something that we're trying to work towards. It's maybe a bit idealistic, but I think, there's some progress being made. So yeah, anything you can provide there would be helpful. And if we could get, somebody, I think I'm almost ready to say we have somebody from ITK in Ottawa who's going to attend, who has expertise in this area, and that I think will really help us. But it's going to be something that happens over time. Like I said, I don't think we'll be completely there for the summit itself, but that's not the intention anyway. So
sure, no, I understand the issue, and there were Indigenous folks at that meeting, and I'm going to actually have a phone conversation tomorrow, and I can talk to this person about making some of those connections. I'll get back to you. Sure.
Okay, great. Yeah, one of the things is we have limitations in terms of space. We have room for about 30 people. We're pushing that at the moment. I have a few people who said they're coming and haven't confirmed, so I can't say we're at that, but we're getting close to it. But I think we will figure out something. If we have people who really need to be there, should be there, then we'll make it work somehow. Okay. Any other thoughts, comments, and particularly any suggestions? And this may not be the right audience. I've spoken with Jessica about working with her to reach out to some of the other IARPA teams and so on. But domain experts who may be able to contribute to something to this process.
Peter, I've just been reviewing I think there's some people in the Year of Polar Prediction effort that could probably contribute to the extreme events. And I'm thinking in particular the group that's, I think it's called SERA, S-E-R-A, which is like the societal impact side of the group. They just published a nice piece today from a workshop that they had. And I'll put it in the chat. It's more related to stakeholders for sea ice forecasts, but I know that the Year of Polar Prediction in general has been doing a lot of work to understand the sort of frontline users of some of the forecast information, and that might help that that particular use case along.
Yeah, that would be great. I am trying to sort of delegate the organization of the use case development. So Rodica and Oystein are on the point for this, but yeah, anything you can provide would be great. And then I can sort of cross-reference with them and see if it's people that they're already working with, or if not, we can bring them into the fold. That'd be excellent. Great, where are we at? Okay, we're actually pushing close to our time. Any other thoughts, comments, general, specific?
Hi, this is Jonathan Blythe. I was looking at the third topic and in the IARPIC website. I think it's phrased a little differently from what you had in your presentation. Is there, do you have like a paragraph on that topic so I could just try to understand it better?
Yeah, well, maybe if you could just send your contact information, where, yeah, you're talking about the resilient community side of things.
Yeah, it seems like that's an evolving topic even because it's different on the IARPIC website, the agenda.
Okay. Yeah, let me take a look at that because is it, yeah, sorry, I'm seeing there's the agenda there.
It says, here it says, enhancing community activities through improved access to physical and social science data. That doesn't reference resilience, and I'm not sure how the word community is being used there.
Yeah, so it has evolved since this initial agenda was put out probably a few weeks ago. So I think though, there's a component of that in terms of what we're trying to do, but this one it's not well defined yet. It's one of those things too that's come up in recent discussion, and we have interest in doing it, but we don't have a lot of capacity for people to do it, or we don't have a lot of capacity within the group that's working to actually do it. So that's why it's a little more vague.
I'll send you my contact information.
Sure.
Coordinate with you all offline. Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
This is Larry Hamilton. At University of New Hampshire. I just had one thought, which is in connection with the resilience issue, to consider social science data as, not just social science, human communities as consumers of physical data, but of social indicators, demographic surveys, et cetera, as potentially valuable resources as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Larry. So we do have at least some participants who are going to be sort of talking about that and engaging us there. So Colleen, who's online, I do some of that work. Andre Petrov from IASA and some others are going to be engaging. Again, it's relatively new, sort of evolving, at least in terms of real forms. But yeah, you're exactly right in figuring out how we identify that. And again, in this one meeting, we're not likely going to be able to figure out all the aspects of it. But we want to make sure that as much as possible, the right things are on the agenda as we go forward. So. And that was initially, I think, as Jonathan pointed out, initially we did have that conversation in the agenda. So that's where the enhancing community activities through improved access to physical and social science data, and then that's sort of now merging into discussions around community resilience and activities and that type of thing. Great, thanks for both of those. Okay, any other comments, questions?
Looking forward to it though, Peter. I wish I could make it, but we'll definitely be looking forward to seeing what comes out of this meeting. It looks great.
Great, and like I said, I try and say to people, you can never get everybody at the table. We have a couple of other people I know who can't make it, but I'm really hoping that if nothing else, we get enough critical mass and enough, as Bill said, sort of active working groups coming out of this, and a plan for how to keep it moving. And even I really like to do at least like a 1-year calendar of events that says these are the 4 or 5 events that are coming up, and let's all, even if we can't be all together, let's keep meeting as much as we can and keep working together. Because I think that's what's lacked in the past. We had really sporadic sort of connections, but I'd say 3 years ago, there was very little in the way of actual funding and actually operational systems. Obviously there were many existing then, but now I think that's increased dramatically in the last even year and a half with all the various new awards and so on. So.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you all, and and please bear with us all. Ruth and I had a conversation about an hour ago. Is almost all of this is being done by volunteers, so we do our best to be as comprehensive and as professional as we can. But we've got our day jobs too that sometimes keep us busy. So we'll do the best that we can, and hopefully at least move us forward incrementally.